Okay, guys, this one really hit me. The perpetrator in this case is a dad, but he's not just a dad. He is the father of the murder victim. And the violent and aggressive nature of the act that he committed is not only unthinkable, it's almost unbelievable. But to be honest, it just gets worse and worse as more details emerge. Strap in, because this one is pretty graphic. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box down below. Many thanks to our guest writer for their help with this episode. Lauren Malt was living in the village of West Winch, which isn't far from King's Lynn in Norfolk. Now, not long after she was born, her mum, Karen, and her dad, Nigel, had another 3 children, and they all grew up together in the family home. Lauren eventually attended the College of West Anglia, and at the same time, she was working a part-time job at a nearby convenience shop. Her mum had previously worked there, and she continued to work there, and so Lauren knew the gig pretty well, and by the time she was 19 in 2022, she was really well adjusted. She managed to balance her work life, her social life, and her studies all really well. However, by this time in Lauren's life, she and her mum and all of her siblings were estranged from her dad at this point. They lived at a different address, they didn't really have any contact with him, and this was because Nigel would drink and do drugs excessively, and this would cause him to become extremely aggressive and violent and angry. Nigel, who walked with a limp from a previous injury, really was angry at the world, partially because of this injury. He felt that he was different, and this anger, he really let that out on his family. He was a violent bully, and he had assaulted Karen at least twice, once in March and once in April of 2021. It was at that point that Karen had then moved the children out of the family home and to an address on Leet Way. Now, after this assault on Karen, Nigel was arrested, but unfortunately he was soon released, and he was released on bail. Now, the conditions of his bail was that he would have no contact with Karen, he would not go to the family home where they were now living, and he would also not go to her shop where she worked. Nigel, though, unsurprisingly, never really accepted that the relationship was over, and on top of this, he felt a huge amount of resentment and anger towards Karen and towards his own children. Now, this was not the first time that he had been violent. It really seems that it got to a peak at this point, causing Karen to leave him and take the children, which obviously taking 4 children with you, finding a whole new home, setting up a whole new life is an extremely difficult and huge task to do. But she managed to do that. However, it later came to light that Lauren had already reported an assault that had happened to her. It was back in 2019, and Lauren had turned up at school, and she said that she had something to report. The previous evening, she'd been out at her boyfriend's house. And by the time she got home, it was later than her dad had told her she could stay out. And because of that, he was extremely angry. So angry, in fact, that he assaulted her as punishment. She said that Nigel had become aggressive, and he had actually tried to run her over by reversing his car towards her. She told officers, quote, "He almost hit me, he nearly hit my leg." Now, thankfully, Lauren did manage to get out of the way just before the car would have hit her. And at the time, Nigel told the police that there'd been an argument, and this was his way of telling Lauren that she needed to listen to him and she needed to tell her parents where she was at all times. Now, it turns out that Lauren decided not to take the matter any further, which is completely understandable. This is her dad. There's a massive complexity here. And so that case wasn't taken any further. I am going to talk a little bit about how Nigel talks about his daughter, Lauren. And given the context of this case and where we get to eventually, bloody shocking and clearly untrue in many ways. But they are his words, so I will let you know when that's the case. So by 2022, Lauren had a new boyfriend, a man called Arthur, and Nigel did not like him. Nigel could be really kind of old-fashioned in some ways. As far as he was concerned, his quote beloved daughter was the only person he had really got in his life, and that's what he said. She should only be seeing men that he approved of, and he did not approve of Arthur. His dislike of Arthur and the disobedience, as he saw it, of Lauren for his wishes only added to his anger. But I just want to say this, and you will get this real quick. Although Nigel claimed that he was just concerned for his daughter dating this Arthur guy, it is so unbelievably obvious that he actually doesn't give a shit about her. He cares about himself and his ego. Although what I think he cares about the most is this control he's absolutely desperate to exert over anyone in his life, especially the women in his life, especially his own daughter, who by now is an adult, by the way. So anyway, at around 6 p.m. on the 23rd of January, Arthur was with Lauren at her mum's house babysitting her little sister, and Karen was at the convenience store. She was doing a shift at work. Now, Nigel did not care about breaking his bail conditions, and so he went to Karen's house to see the family. But when he banged on the door, Lauren ignored it. She probably knew that it was Nigel, and obviously he wasn't going to be happy that Arthur was there. Nigel tried the door, but it was locked. Then, also in breach of his bail conditions, he went to the shop to see Karen. When he got there, he told Karen that the door might be locked, but he could always find a way to break in. He told her he had a crowbar in the boot of his car and he threatened to use it. Now, while he was telling Karen this, her phone started to ring, and when she answered it, it was Lauren. Lauren was asking if she and Arthur could take her little sister to the shop. Now, Nigel overheard what was going on the phone, and he said that he'd drive around and he'd pick her up. Obviously, Karen tried to dissuade this. She knew that Lauren was with Arthur and that there would be trouble if Nigel found them together. But Nigel was not going to listen to Karen, and he was determined. He made 19 attempted phone calls to Lauren between 6:25 p.m. and 6:52 p.m. This man is obsessive. He very clearly sees Lauren as his property. And the fact she's not answering her phone for whatever reason made Nigel angrier and angrier. No doubt the resentment he felt about his own life and Lauren's, quote, disobedience escalated his negative emotions. And so after that, he left the shop where Karen was working and he drove to Leetway to the house. He parked on the driveway, got out of his car, went round to the boot of his Mercedes and he opened it. Inside lay that crowbar, and so he picked it up and then he walked straight over to the front door and he started banging on it. He clearly knew at this point that Arthur was there and he started violently shouting for Arthur to come out. It seemed as though he was intent on harming, or given what we know is about to happen, maybe even killing Arthur. Lauren opened the door, she saw Nigel and she stepped out, so she was sort of blocking the entrance to the house and Nigel couldn't get in very easily. She told Nigel to stop threatening Arthur and to, quote, fuck off. Arthur then stepped out of the house behind Lauren, and that's when Nigel told Lauren to get out of the way and he started towards Arthur with that crowbar. Now, by now, this is quite a small street and the neighbours are starting to worry and wonder what's going on, what is all this shouting about. They're looking outside of their windows, they're sort of pulling the curtains open, some even open their front doors, and they're trying to get a gauge of what is actually happening. And so a lot of the account of what we have is from witness testimony. There are a lot of witnesses of what was about to unfold. Nigel pushed past Lauren and he raised the sharp end of the crowbar up. He swung the crowbar towards Arthur, who turned and he just ran, and he actually ran down a little alleyway to the side of the house, and he managed to somehow get up onto the conservatory roof of one of Lauren's neighbours' houses. And Nigel, who was just too drunk and high from cocaine use, wasn't actually able to follow him. Lauren was now standing behind Nigel's car and she was shouting at him, telling him to go away, to leave the house and leave them alone. The pair have a few words, they continue to argue in the street before Nigel decides that he couldn't catch and hurt Arthur with his crowbar, and so he's frustrated that his coercive control of his daughter no longer works, and so that is when he makes the decision to get back into his Mercedes. Lauren was still standing behind the car shouting at him, and this was probably something that was extremely difficult for Nigel to really understand or accept. This didn't happen a lot. He'd always been able to control the women in his life through manipulation, through coercion, and if that ever didn't work, he would just use violence. He would hit them and ultimately make them do what he wanted. The pair continued to argue in the street before Nigel, Furious that he couldn't catch and hurt Arthur with his crowbar, and frustrated that his coercive control of his daughter no longer worked, got back into his Mercedes and started to drive away. Lauren was still standing behind it, shouting at him. This was probably something he found extremely hard to accept or really to understand. He'd always been able to control the women in his life through manipulation and coercion. If that didn't work, he'd just hit them, and that made them do what he wanted. That had always been the case, until about a year earlier in 2021, when Lauren's mum Karen had decided that there was just no way she could protect herself or her children if she stayed with Nigel. She knew her children would be next, and so that's when she reported Nigel's violence to the police. After that, she and her children moved out to a place of safety, breaking Nigel's control, or at least trying to break that control. But now, with Lauren going out with someone that he did not approve of and actually actively fought against her seeing, this seems to be just more than Nigel's tiny little brain can take, and his huge massive ego means that he really thinks that he can just sort of manipulate Lauren into ending things with her boyfriend. It's really evident in this case that Nigel is just not used to people standing up to him, especially women. He can't quite grasp the actuality of what's going on, and he probably just sees it as disobedience and as though there's things he can do to get them to follow his orders or wishes again. And so, back to the day where he's drunk and high, he's just been threatening Arthur, and after that hadn't worked, he'd gone back to his car, he'd started the engine and begun to drive away from Lauren. Now, Lauren started to follow him on foot. She's still shouting at him, but it wasn't long before she turned back towards the house and started making her way as though she was going back inside. But this is where Nigel made a decision that completely changed everything for Lauren and her family. He stopped the car, put it in reverse, and he put his foot on the accelerator. Lauren was about 20 metres behind the car, and so as Nigel started reversing, he pressed his foot down harder. It hit speeds of 5, then 10, then 20 miles an hour. It seems that Lauren was oblivious to the fact that the car was reversing towards her. As far as she was concerned, she was walking back into the house and she'd heard her dad start to drive away, so there's no reason for her to think that he's now reversing towards her. Nigel ran into Lauren with the car, and 20 miles an hour at this short distance, he rammed into his own daughter and she fell immediately to the ground. She was pinned by the enormous weight of her dad's car. But Nigel did not stop there. He continued reversing the car and it jolted over Lauren's body until the entire weight of the vehicle crushed her. After that, he put the car in forward gear and edged forward until it once again mounted Lauren's body and rose and fell as he drove over her for a second time. The detail in this next part is pretty horrific, fair warning, but I think it is important to talk about this and to really give you the gravitas of how awfully violent this man's actions were. It would later be shown that Lauren's bones had cracked as Nigel drove over her. Her back broke with the weight of the car, her breastbones broke, her ribs broke, and her liver ruptured, causing catastrophic internal bleeding. Lauren was bleeding to death. Once he had driven over his daughter a second time, he stopped the vehicle. Lauren was still conscious but in severe pain, and she lay there groaning in agony. Now, obviously, we know the neighbours have been watching this happen, and so one of the neighbours at this point has managed to run over towards Lauren, and as the neighbour's getting down on the floor to see how she is, Nigel gets out of the car with Lauren's body lying near the rear wheels of his vehicle, and he sees that Lauren's now silent, and the next thing he says is, quote, "Where's Arthur? Where's Arthur?" This man has literally no concern for his daughter, who he's just run over. Neighbours were now on the phone to ambulances and police services, and Nigel just started to look for Arthur again. Now, after a few moments of being inside and around the house, he emerged from the house, seemingly unable to find Arthur, and that's when he looked down at Lauren lying on the ground and said, quote, "Lauren, get up, please." After it was clear she wasn't moving, he started repeating over and over again, quote, "She's my daughter, she's my daughter." A neighbour who had run to Lauren's side said, quote, "I know she's your daughter and you've just fucking killed her." All Nigel could say was, "Don't get the police." Nigel tried to pick Lauren up and he kept saying, help me get her in the car. The neighbour told Nigel to fuck off and just wait for the ambulance, although by now it was evident that Lauren was dead. She was making no noise and there were no signs of life. Nigel then picked her body up and, from witness accounts, quote, slung his daughter in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes. The neighbour said, at least put her in the back of the car if you're going to take her, but Nigel took no notice and said, I've got to get her to A&E. He then drove off quite erratically and made a phone call on his way. This phone call was to Lauren's mother, Karen, and this is awful. This whole case is unbelievable, but this next bit is really quite chilling. He called his ex-partner and he said, quote, I've run your daughter over, she's dead. Karen screamed at him down the phone, which one, but he wouldn't tell her. Nigel didn't go straight to A&E. Instead, he drove to the convenience store where Karen worked. And as he arrived, Karen thought her daughter must be okay, but when his car arrived and she opened up the door, a feeling of dread started to come over her. Quote, I just knew she wasn't going to make it. She was stuffed in the footwell. I saw her face and felt sick. She added that seeing her in that position was worse than knowing she had been run over, which I would argue is probably one of the reasons that Nigel drove there with his daughter in the footwell. It's likely he wanted Karen to see what he'd done. It's absolutely no surprise, but Nigel literally had no concern for the irreversible trauma he was about to inflict on Karen. Nigel then drove Lauren to King Lynn's Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where a few minutes after her admission, she was formally pronounced dead at 7:47 p.m. Police, who had already arrived at the murder scene, talked to witnesses and immediately dispatched crews to the hospital. Nigel was arrested initially on suspicion of drunk driving. He'd been breathalyzed and he was found to be over the legal limit. Nigel was taken into police custody at King Lynn's police station, where he was questioned by detectives. Now, as he was taken away, he said, quote, my baby, it's my mistake which has caused all of this. Yes, obviously that's the case. Nigel's black Mercedes was also seized at the hospital and taken for examination by crime scene investigators. Almost immediately, he was charged with murder, kidnap, and false imprisonment. The kidnap and false imprisonment charges were eventually dropped after evidence showed that he was taking Lauren to hospital when he moved her from the crime scene. In Nigel's first police interview, he started by blaming the whole incident on Arthur, claiming it was he who had come out of Lauren's house behaving aggressively, shouting abuse and running about, quote, and these are his words, like a deer with no head and a headless chicken. He claimed Lauren told him her boyfriend would hurt him. Lauren told him to go, which he attempted to do because, quote, that's what she told me. If I wanted to reverse over someone, I would have got him. He said that he wished he had left but wanted to protect his daughter and that her boyfriend had no right to be there. No right to be there is what he said. It's literally a breach of his bail terms for him to be there, but he's complaining about his daughter's boyfriend who has full consent from the homeowners to be there. He's saying that Arthur doesn't have a right to be there. This man is delusional. He's delusional. When police asked what he felt Lauren needed protecting from, Nigel said, quote, she stabbed herself because of him. On Saturday she went to the hospital. On Sunday, I wouldn't have gone there if I knew Arthur was there. It was a shock to me he was there. I was expecting to get my baby and we would go out to get some dinner. It was quite a shock to be there, her shouting abuse at me. Nigel's version of events was that he went to leave and began driving off when he heard shouting behind him. So he stopped the car, reversed, and then heard, in his words, a bump. He looked in his rearview mirror, wing mirror, and over his shoulder and thought he'd hit a wheelie bin. He drove forward, only to hear another bang. Quote, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was Lauren, my beautiful little daughter. It's ridiculous. If I had seen her, I would have stopped. He got out of the car and found Lauren. Quote, it was my baby. I didn't realise it was my baby. I was devastated. She was just in a mess. I didn't mean to hit Lauren. I didn't know it was her. I love her. I am never ever going to get over this. In his version, as soon as he realised he had hit her, he tried to help her. But, of course, witness reports completely disproved Nigel's version of events. One described Nigel as brandishing this dark black-grey crowbar before using it to gesture at Arthur. They described Nigel chasing Arthur and deliberately reversing over Lauren. When witness accounts from neighbours were put to him, he said they were all lying. He described the witness statements as a lot of rubbish and told police he had the crowbar in his car for the reasons of splitting wood for his log burner, and that he'd taken it out of the house a week before the incident. It was just a coincidence that it had been there and that he'd been able to grab it on that day. In further interviews, Nigel said he did not have clear recollection and sometimes suffered with brain fog. Quote, "My statement, what I told you earlier, is what I remember. I have not lied to you. I'm not proud of it. It's disgusting and not nice." When the results of the Home Office post-mortem examination were received, they established the preliminary cause of death as chest and abdominal injuries. Nigel appeared at Norwich Magistrates Court in January 2022 to confirm his name and details. At that time, there was no application for bail and he was remanded in custody. A plea and trial preparation hearing took place in April, where he pleaded not guilty, and his trial started on the 29th of June. The prosecution described Nigel's relationships as marred by drinking, drug-taking, and anger. They spoke about the events I outlined earlier, with the basic details being that he went to the house, no one answered the door, he then drove to Karen's workplace, he then made 19 phone calls to her home, where Lauren and her boyfriend Arthur were, before he returned there. He threatened Arthur with a crowbar, Lauren told him to go home, he was totally consumed with anger, and he intended to kill Lauren, or at least cause her serious harm. This is what the prosecution argued. He reversed his car into his daughter, knocked her to the ground, stopped, and then rather than switch off his engine and get out of the car, instead he took the conscious and deliberate steps of driving forwards over her body. Quote, "It was a deliberate act intended to inflict maximum harm. He used his car as a lethal weapon. Effectively, she was crushed to death. These actions killed Lauren Malt, and later examination of her body revealed bruising, lacerations, and crushing injuries to her head, torso, arms, and legs." The prosecution outright dismissed Nigel's claims that he had hit some kind of wheelie bin. They said if a wheelie bin had been in the street, he would have seen it. Lauren was the only thing in the road the entire time. After running over his daughter, a witness had shouted at him, quote, "You've killed her." And there is actual mobile phone footage that shows Nigel telling that neighbour, quote, "Don't get the police." The prosecution continued with the series of events which led to Nigel driving his dead daughter's body to his ex-partner Karen's place of work and showing her. The murder had been the culmination of a history of coercion and controlling behaviour. In his defence, Nigel was expected to give evidence, but his legal team had told the jury that this actually wasn't going to happen. Within the trial, the defence ended up cross-examining the road collision investigator, and he did agree that it was not possible to be sure that Nigel had seen Lauren standing behind the car before he'd run over her, but equally, he may well have done. Now, the defence did accept that their client was behind the wheel of the car, that their client was drunk and still had some cocaine in his system, but they said that Nigel had been there to have it out with Arthur, and that he was so distracted by his own anger towards Arthur, so hell-bent on having the last word, that instead of making the proper checks to make sure that no one was behind him or around him, he reversed at speed and in temper. They said it was not to kill his daughter or cause his daughter serious harm. The defence told the jury that there was never any intention to hurt Lauren or kill her, so they had to return a verdict of not guilty. After just a day of deliberations, the jury did return their verdict. They found Nigel guilty, and he was sentenced to a life term with a minimum serving time of 18 years before parole eligibility. Since the trial, Nigel has had his appeal dismissed. And beyond that, the sentence that he was given initially was actually found to be too lenient. And so towards the end of 2022, 3 judges ruled a significant upwards adjustment to a minimum of 22 years before parole eligibility. And this was to reflect the aggravating circumstances, including the history of coercion and controlling behaviour. They found the original minimum sentence was unduly lenient. The Lord Justice said, quote, "We accept that the use of the car as a weapon is a serious aggravating feature, as is the fact that the offender deliberately reversed at high speed." Lauren's mum, Karen, said, quote, "My heart was broken. I just can't fathom it, how a parent can kill their own child and how anyone could put their child in the footwell of a car with no care." She said that she was in the process of getting a divorce and that in any normal world she would change her name, but she's decided not to because it is a lasting link to Lauren. Quote, "I must share the name with a person that murdered my daughter in order that I can be close to my daughter." Lauren's family then released a statement paying tribute to a deeply loved daughter and sister who would never be forgotten. Lauren was a beautiful young woman who was loved by many. She had so much to live for and had so many dreams, which sadly she will never complete as her life was tragically taken. A big challenge and issue with this case is that Nigel repeatedly proved how controlling and coercive he was. And there were bail conditions in place, but he breached those orders and ended up contacting his wife and going to her house, ultimately finding and killing Lauren whilst he was there. MP Jess Phillips, who was Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding at the time, said, quote, "There needs to be a better monitoring system, a register of repeat and violent perpetrators and stalkers where monitoring systems, not dissimilar to sex offenders registers, exist." Jess said the reality was that when people call police regarding breaches, the police just simply don't have the resource to respond to this. And most victims of domestic abuse do know that. So it seems that in a lot of cases, there's just not much point, or it appears there's not much point in reporting this. Detective Chief Inspector Holly Evans has said that they will be looking, quote, "at what opportunities there were for any positive changes that can be made. Everything has to be treated on a case-by-case basis, and the restrictions rely on people informing the police, which is not always an easy thing for them to do. We will work with partners to make sure those seeking to be protected can come forward to us and report these things so we can take a positive course of action." Lauren needlessly lost her life at the hands of her father, the very person who should protect her and keep her safe. This moment of rage had fatal consequences for Lauren and life-changing ones for the rest of her family, who continue to grieve for her.